Hi everyone, and welcome to NetBase Quid Live, our lockdown edition of our annual main conference. It's certainly a first for us to be using this format. We usually have these events in New York and London and all over the world, but we're delighted that you're able to join us today from the comfort of your laptops in this virtual conference. Really excited about this session with Aaron Bernstein from Walmart, because I think it's a session where there's a lot of interesting lessons to share with those of you that are tuned in today. Aaron and I have worked very closely together now for over 5 years, actually. Sorry for Aaron on that. But, in that time, we've been able to do some great work together. And I've seen how Aaron has developed his team massively over those 5 years and developed a highly leveraged insight capability for Walmart that started out operating in quite a restricted area of the company. And over those 5 years, he has built out, using a combination of people and technologies, a highly leveraged capability that now affects really the whole organization and at every level of the organization as well. So what I'd like to get at today in our conversation in this fireside chat with Aaron is lessons for you all in how he did this, and including very practical hands-on lessons for how you can learn from this approach as well. So when we met, Aaron and his team were working in the corporate affairs division of Walmart, and Aaron was responsible for quite a few functional areas, actually, one of which was to generate insights within the corporate affairs area. And fast forward 5 years, and that team is now influencing a large number of different functional areas, still from that base, but on a much bigger scale. So I suppose, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us for this session, and dialed in from Benderville. I'm here near San Francisco, and thanks for joining us. And we'd love to, first of all, just hear a bit more about your journey over the past 5 years.
Yeah, sure. It's pleasure to be here. We started working together 5 years ago, and how much has changed, and sort of the journey that we've been on. And I just remember, sort of the early days of, trying to onboard this sort of foreign, complex, frightening, job-threatening technology, and introduce this to people, in a way that didn't sort of evoke some sort of visceral and confused reaction. And I think you'll remember, the early days when we'd sort of make the round around sort of Executive Row and meet with people all over the business, sort of talking about this sort of emergence of data and technology and the power it has in generating, intelligence and insights from unstructured open source, allowing people to sort of understand things in domains in a matter of seconds, right? And sort of present that in a very sort of contextual way. And it was very, it was very challenging to sort of get people to sort of buy into it, because it was different, right? I mean, it sort of disrupted status quo. It wasn't what people were used to, which was more kind of the big sort of consultancy driven research projects, right? Where you're investing a lot of money and resources to get questions answered, and it's more human powered and generated, pretty significant sort of outputs in terms of 100-page PowerPoint presentations that, in my view, sort of left people with more questions than they started with, and then we were proposing kind of a alternative solution, which was, hey, look, we can answer your questions, and we're agnostic to the questions. We have an ability to at least get you 60 or 70% of the information, which, is more than sufficient in my view, just because I think the directional nature of data is, just as powerful, to try to sort of achieve some sort of absolute certainty is sort of impossible and kind of a waste of time. And the more technology that's become available, the more data that's accessible, and the ability to sort of connect that back into business strategy, comm strategy, marketing strategy, merchandising strategy, investment strategy, M&A strategy, really any strategy, right? Is hugely sort of powerful. And so, I don't know if you sort of have sort of blocked some of those memories out of your mind share.
I definitely had.
With our tails between our legs, but
I definitely had.
Turned.
No, I really appreciate that reminder of some of those first trips that I made to Bentonville, and like you say, going around departments with you, introducing the capability. And it's a great reminder that we were, at the time, very focused on explaining the technology and what it could do. But, as you say, it wasn't easy at the start. This is a new technology, a new approach, and it was something that people weren't immediately able to see how it would be applied. And I think also in there was a good reminder and a good lesson from what you just shared, which really, I think, turned the corner for this being distributed, which is that you took the technology and your team were able to turn around quick answers for people. And that's what brought it to life. It was when we had a round of conversations. People were always very interested. They wanted to meet. But then it was hard to say, okay, how do we get started? But when it really clicked is when we would come away we would go into the meetings and start to ask people, what do you care most about right now? What are you struggling to understand? And let us take away a couple of those questions and come back to you with something. And the fact that using Quid, your team was able to go back to those executives within 1 or 2 days with content that, as you say, it was directionally correct and interesting in terms of strategy. That's what really blew people away. I mean, they weren't used to seeing answers within, even within weeks to those kinds of questions. So the fact you could go back so quickly and then iterate with them, I think that really brought it to life, and that changed people's attention, and they didn't have to worry about the underlying tech or the approach or what do the networks mean. They were able to just get the insights, and that brought it to life for them. So I think that was quite effective.
Yeah, I think I think one of the big differences that I sort of see today versus, back then is back then we had to spend time justifying the technology, right? And like people wouldn't just take the output for what it is. They'd really sort of question kind of the methodology and like the NLP behind it. And today, like no one, I very rarely ever get into sort of like, deep dives into like, what's the technology? How does it work? Yes, people find it interesting, but no one questions it. They just take it as sort of like as a reliable sort of source of information and a generator of insight. And so now it's just like, people just focus on the output, where before, like we had to justify our technology before they would buy in on the output.
Yeah, that makes sense. It actually gets me wondering what we'll be saying 5 years from now about this topic, because it strikes me that there is such a shift that's happening around. I mean, you talk about communications technology, with me.
Well, I think 5 years from now, it will have 2 robots, the technology, and you and I will just be obsolete.
We'll see if we get there in 5 years.
Yeah.
But no, it will be interesting to see, what when we look back. I imagine that we'll be talking about the struggles of 2020 and getting these things. Yes, it's come a long way in 5 years, but it strikes me that we're still in the early stage of this journey when it comes to deploying technologies like this into marketing and communications. And as the AI gets more sophisticated and as these approaches become more familiar and accepted, then I think this journey is just going to continue. So I imagine there's a number of you in the audience wondering about how to get started with this. Clearly, Aaron's team has got a lot of success integrating these kinds of capabilities, but it can be very daunting to know where to get started. Or perhaps you've started on the journey and you're wondering how to scale it. So, Aaron, do you have any tips or advice for those folks tuned in on what they can do next? What are some of the steps that you'd recommend people take to build out an insight function like this?
Yeah, it's the it's the million dollar question. And I think like the reality is there's not a sort of single sort of solution on any of this. Just find like the most simplest ways to integrate some technology into your sort of day-to-day strategy and decision making. And then, then the things that like you can control, which I think are a bit more like cultural or sort of ways of working, right? Like, there are a lot of insights organizations, that I think still, operate very vertical, right? Which, where one person is responsible for competitor intelligence, one person's responsible for financial services intelligence, one person's responsible for healthcare insights, and I think like that, that can work, but our approach, in contrast has been, look, we're not subject matter experts in anything. We can answer any question. Like the data is the subject matter expert, and the technology enables us to present that back to you in a way that you can understand. So, maybe thinking about organizations in a bit more of like a horizontal way versus a vertical way when it comes to insights, is something that can also sort of lead you down a path of sort of digital technology integration. So, look, I think there's not a single source of truth here. There's not one magic solution. It takes time, but I think it's a lot easier to sort of, like I said, ride that wave today than it was 5 years ago. And the challenge for us, Bob, is like, well, what's the next wave, right? Because you always want to sort of stay ahead of it. And I think using sort of the power of like our infrastructure, hopefully will give us foresight into like what that next wave is.
Yeah, you've reminded me of several things that I've seen your team do that isn't necessarily very common, and just to note a few of the things there that you've touched on and that I've seen. One is this horizontal approach that you take to insights. Your team doesn't restrict itself to the domain that it is supposed to just be working. You take that license and say, what, we've seen this over here in competitive intelligence, and you create the insight and you distribute it. And it provokes a conversation, and sometimes people come back and they ask for deeper analysis from your team. But it means that no one sort of gives that remit necessarily, but the fact that your team has taken that to take a horizontal approach has opened up a huge number of doors, and you've become an accepted insights function broadly because of that. Another thing I've seen your team do is that you listen very attentively to the key challenges and ideas from leadership, and you work on those again preemptively. Your team doesn't wait to be asked to do an analysis in a certain area by an executive. You and the team will listen to what the executives are saying publicly, listen to what's being communicated internally, read between the lines and watch the news, and you are able to consistently surface things that are interesting to the highest level of executives at the company, because you're listening and responding to what they care about most. And therefore what it matters most to the organization. And that's something that I think a lot of teams can benefit from, in my experience, seeing what your team has done. So hopefully that's another helpful thing for those of you that are tuned in to consider.
Well, I think reactive, but just trying to just sort of proactively share insights and value as you see it, and look, I sort of like, it's sort of analogous to like, use a sports analogy, like putting sort of shots on the goal, and like my view is just, look, I want to put as many shots on the goal as possible. Some will go in, like some will go, wide or over the crossbar. Some will get saved by the goalie. and don't get discouraged. Like, you know, we send insights all over the company on various things that we just, and like, you know, there are a lot of times like I don't hear back on any of them, you know, and then other times and then other times, but that's not to say that they're not actually getting ingested. It just means that you know, it hasn't come full circle, and not necessarily like, nor necessarily should it, right? Like I don't have, we're not in charge of like, you know, operationalizing the insight, like, and turning it into an action. Our view is like, look, we just surface up the information. Here's an insight. Here's an opportunity. You know, run with it or don't run with it. That's up to you. I'm on to the next thing. Like, and then if you circle back for more, great, we're going to re-engage. But it's just like, you know, you just gotta keep moving forward, keep surfacing ideas. Cause you just, again, like, to me, this is a volume game, you know, like, cause there's so much happening, like, second by second out there. Like, more is different today than like the same. And so, you know, if you're not just in a constant state of intellectual curiosity, right? It's sort of maybe the best way I could say it. Like, and then using, you know, your technology capabilities and data to satisfy that sort of thirst for intellectual curiosity. I mean, that, you know, I think you're just going to be probably missing out on a lot of things that that are just happening around you that you just wouldn't be aware of. So
yeah, it's a great way to put it. You know, that it's about thinking about what the issues may be and circulating those. And we've seen situations where you might put out an insight, and as you say, it's tumbleweeds, no one gets back. But then 6 months later, something comes up and someone gets back to you and says, you know what, that was spot on. Now we need you to go deeper on that. And it's also meant that I've noticed that you've become more of a go-to for the top execs when they have new urgent issues that come up. Because who else are they going to turn to that could give them an answer on the same day, that could actually take in and ingest all the relevant information and respond the same day with some meaningful direction from how the world's reacted to a certain issue. So I think that's, you know, that's been a powerful part of your, as you put it, shots on goal approach. Right. And not worrying too deeply about following through a complete and comprehensive analysis, but rather saying, here's what we've seen a trend, we've seen something here. You know, it's, in a way, you're asking the questions, and that's one of the things that's very powerful. You know, it makes me think of something else that your team seems to do well in translation of the data, which is that you tell stories, right? Your team don't just put out the data, they don't just send a chart. They actually reveal what that underlying story is, or the thing that's interesting. Maybe you could share, you know, any guidelines you have for our audience on how do you take that data and turn it into a story? What are some of the practical things you do so that when someone receives something from you, they're not left scratching their heads, but they kind of understand the underlying message?
Yeah. You know, look, a lot of it's honestly just in like, how do you package up the information, you know? And so, you know, are you just going to like attach a, you know, 20-page PDF, you know, with a bunch of charts and graphs, or are you going to actually like maybe narrate through a summary of key findings, or, you know, key, you know, particularly like not just sort of generic, you know, here's sort of the key findings of like within the domain, but then here are like 3 or 4 opportunities for Walmart specifically.
Yeah, I've noticed that your emails, even to executives, tend to be very short. The you know, the one sentence captures what you've discovered, and then if you attach anything, it's, you know, 1 or 2 pages, you know, at most. And initially, right, it might be a page with some key insights, and then a page with like, you know, the main visualization that gets the message across. But then, and I mean, this doesn't work in all company cultures, but at least at, you know, Walmart executives, that certainly has been that seems to be what's most popular and that people respond to. And as you say, people just don't have time to read through large depth when it comes to a senior audience. So over the past 5 years, it's been very interesting from my perspective to see Walmart's evolution and journey, because from when the CEO, Doug McMillon, came in, he set out a vision and a strategy for Walmart, and it's been, you know, pursued ever since. And in the external environment, Walmart has run into, naturally, all kinds of issues and had some very big moments where it's had to make decisions through those 5 years. So it'd be fascinating to hear a bit from your perspective, Aaron, about what that journey has been like at Walmart, and about some of the big decisions that you've ended up getting, embroiled in and having to come up with insights around.
Yeah, it's it seems sort of like, fairly evergreen, right? Just because there's always an issue, there's always some sort of complexity that's surrounding the Walmart brand, and it's just a byproduct of, our size and scale, that, we've got, 150 million customers that shop with Walmart every week, that, we, are sort of integrated into, almost every sort of facet of sort of life, not just at a consumer level, but also sort of socially, politically, economically, culturally, and so forth. So, anything that's sort of happening out in like the environment, like has a, for the most part, has some influence and effect on Walmart. And, for us, the importance of not being biased and not always looking inward, but rather understanding what's happening outside of the four walls, and really understanding what's happening outside the four walls first and foremost, provides, a lot of context and sort of intelligence and the ability to sort of see around the corner in terms of what could be coming next, whether that's from a sort of consumer behavior perspective, whether that's from a technology perspective, whether that's from a, sort of a digitally native brand perspective. I mean, where, being able to provide some sort of kind of, predictive insight, enables like the business to make sort of decisions, not just for today, but for tomorrow. And so, and that's ever more important, in today's environment where, the business is growing, the ecosystem's expanding, the offerings and, the customer offerings, both from a delivery and perspective, at home, in store, the growth of e-commerce. I mean, the competitive landscape, which is, more challenging every second. At the end of the day, it's like, the being able to kind of have your fingers on the pulse of what's happening, outside of the Walmart environment, and then connecting the back into the Walmart environment, enables you to sort of be involved in, and provide, a value proposition, across all sort of issues and initiatives. We did that American Family Report a couple of years ago that was, I think really innovative, at its time, and really shed light on, some really emerging trends. Like, I mean, I was looking the other day, Bob, like 3-4 years ago, we did that, the first one, and the first major trend that we identified using both sort of the Quid technology to look at unstructured open source, but then also our own Walmart transaction data to see how customers were buying and what they were doing from a behavioral perspective, saw that, like, over the counter and pharmacies and pharmacists were like replacing doctors as like primary care physicians. Like, more people were, trying to, get ahead of illness and self-medicate, buying into herbal substances and garlic and turmeric. It was just like, hey, I don't have time to go to the doctor anymore. Like, I'm using like retail pharmacies as a primary care physician. And so, like, you fast forward to today and you're like, of course we didn't predict a pandemic, but that still holds. It's even stronger today than it was 4 years ago.
Mm. Yeah, I remember when we did that analysis now, for the American Family Report, and discovered that connection, that you'd seen this early signs of increased sales in certain goods, like, groceries rather, like ginger and turmeric and so on. And what was interesting is that the sales numbers had started to shift, but the underlying question was why.
Right.
why, what is the purpose? What is this fulfilling in people's lives? And it was by that analysis we did of the 2 million mom blogs and parenting blogs from across the US over 1 year. And by reading that and analyzing that, that's where we saw we were able to surface those insights and tune in to what it was really fulfilling, the need it was fulfilling for families and the specific context. So that was a fascinating example. And, coming to your points about looking outside the four walls, I think the way you describe that really embodies perhaps the most important trend that we have seen through our customers in this industry over the past 5 years, which is that it's more and more important to be agile and responsive to the external environment. But the connections in that environment can no longer be singled out in certain areas. They are so connected, and it's more important than ever that insights functions can take a range of different external data sets and see the connections and context across those data sets. And the way that you just described, reminded me that you use social, news, startup information, intellectual property analysis. Each of these data sets give you a different lens on the future. And you use the phrase that Doug introduced at Walmart, looking around the corner. He challenged the organization many years ago now when he came in to say, we need to do better at looking around the corner. And I love that phrase because it gets past the notion of predictive analytics and into the notion of looking ahead. And while it may not be possible to 100% accurately say what's going to happen in the future, it's absolutely possible to look ahead, to look around the corner and see what's coming. And that's something that I think your team have done so well. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us and doing this session together. It's been a pleasure to be reminded of some of our work together, and thank you for sharing those insights with our audience. And thank you all for joining this session. Great to have you here. And I really hope you get to enjoy many more of the sessions that we have. We have a packed agenda over a total of 3 days here at NetBase Quid Live. And I hope you get a lot from the various sessions that are available coming right up. And thank you all, and see you.